Well, we're going to do the first layer today on this piece. And so there's a couple of things to know before you get started on this piece. Number one, it's going to look shitty. Like, that's the stage that it's at. And this is usually the stage where beginning artists end things and then they're really, really disappointed. This is the underlayer. And as far as underlayer goes, I know we've already done two entire videos on how to create the first underlayer. Well, this is the first painting underlayer. So a lot goes into art and you kind of got to just stick with it. So trust it and allow it to just be created, you know? Okay, and so one thing that's also really important to remember here is a good time, this is a good time to like shut all the doors and not let anybody come in, because this is the stage usually where people will come up to me and be like, yo, you're a painter? You're an artist? Are you sure? Because my 2-year-old could do that. And I'm like, painting isn't the same as drawing. Whew, get your drunk ass off me. So anyways, shut the doors, stop your own critic, and power through it. Next week we'll get into what the second layer goes. So always remember, like, you can put a second layer on, and the first layer never looks good. Okay, it just doesn't. So, you ready to get started? Okay, let's go.
Okay, so here we are where we left off last week. We drew the shading in, and now we're mixing the paint up. So one of the first things to remember when you're starting the underlayer of painting is you get to start with a broom. You start with a huge brush. I recommend a paintbrush that you would normally use to do a house paint, and start with the background. Notice how I'm starting with the blue of the sky. And that kind of blue doesn't really matter because, again, that first layer. So pick the shapes and the shades you like. But I find that this underpainting time period is perfect for using up all of those cheap acrylic paints that you probably have lying around. I mean, if you have family members like I do who really like to buy me art supplies, but then forget to ask me what kind of art supplies I like. Thanks, guys. I appreciate you. But one of the most common things for people to get me as a painter is cheap-ass acrylic paint. And let me tell you, like, cheap-ass acrylic paint is goopy and it's not super fun to work with, especially as a painter and as an artist. But it does have the benefit of being perfect for these underpaintings. So I mean, if you don't have somebody that buys you cheap paint and you want a quick, cheap paint for it, go ahead and grab Liquitex. It's super cheap. Acrylic from any art store. I think you can get it for like $3-4. Sometimes $5. I guess sometimes $5 for a giant tube. And you go ahead and pick out whatever colors you want, and you don't need more than a tube of each color that you want. So maybe a blue and a green, and I mean, I like green. So you could get, honestly, you could just get the basic primaries. You could get blue, red, and orange. I mean, sorry, orange is not the actual basic primary. Blue, red, and yellow is, but I have a lot of orange because, again, people give me many types of oranges. So here I'm painting with that big white handled brush. I took some basic blue and I mixed it with white so that it was a lighter color. And now I'm going back over things and checking it and putting the brush around there. And now I'm going to be mixing the next color. The next color that I'm going to jump on top of is those shaded lines. So I feel like for the top one, I mixed purple and green together to make a very solidly purple mud. And so that purple mud is really great because when you mix colors that are complementary, they make mud. They look beautiful next to one another in paintings, but when you mix them together, they make this like kind of brown version of color. So this stage right here where you're painting the mural and you're adding in the shadows and the shading, it's the perfect time to think about, if you're doing this for yourself, then just keep doing what you're doing. But if you're doing this with littles, this is like the perfect stage for them to help you after you finish the shadows. Because it is such a strange, weird, like ethereal part of the process that their paint strokes would be super easy to just like knock out and put on there, and then you can come in and like clean them up with the second layer. So yeah, if you have any littles, and I wouldn't recommend anybody under 5. I honestly wouldn't recommend anybody under 6. helping out, but you know, you might have a really awesome 6-year-old that has really good control. And if you do that, remember to put down a whole bunch of paint. What is it called? I call it paint cover, but I use big carpets on the floor, but you probably are not using your carpets as paint towels. That's the wrong word again. Anyways, put something down on the floor, plastic, some thick canvas, something like that, so that you can paint on top of it. So see how I'm going over the things right there, and it's kind of a purple color. So it's darker purple because I mixed in the green, but it's not a terrible purple. And now I'm going to go to the base so that the tree is still kind of grounded in reality. But if you notice, like, there's a difference in the lighting. On the base, I'm creating this lighting that's like, oh, look, it has a full tree. And on the top, I'm creating this lighting that makes it a lot more like 2D. So, you know, again, work with your own version of lighting. And I'm looking back at my own work, so it's always a little bit different when you're looking backwards versus when you're staring at it. Yeah. Okay, so now here comes the stage where we're actually throwing on color. Those colors have dried just a little bit, and I began tossing green on. Yep, I began tossing a green on. So I'm using the lighter green on the outside, and then I'm going to mix it into the purple, but the purple's had a little bit of a chance to dry, but not completely, because I want some of it to come and pull itself out. Now, acrylic dries really quickly, so it's not watercolor fast, but it's pretty fast. So if you apply it thickly, that's why I'm using a big brush, so I can pull in the pieces, so it can come in and out, and it kind of mixes on the canvas, which I really like. I use a palette knife for my mixing just a little bit, but then most of the time, I mix on the canvas as I'm working. Now, feel free to make sure you mix, like, while you're working on it and however you want, but that's just how I do it. Okay, so now see I'm jumping on top with the green, and you see how it's much darker, but it also starts to infuse it with how it's going to look in the future. You can begin to see a picture of how it's going to look. And I think that that's really fun. This is one of my favorite stages, actually, the ugly stage of creating art. So see how I'm working the color in with the purple? It's a lot brighter, but it still has a darkness behind it. And remember how we talked about last week that I was creating negative space because I'm going to really pop the small houses? That's totally what's happening. And one thing to think about is that your paint dries different than it looks when it's going on. The wet luster disappears. And so, like, creating that shine and that luster is something that you have to do actually in choosing the right colors. So it's going to shift and it's going to change. So now I did the top part of the tree, and if you notice I painted over some of the lines, like on the tire swing and where the rope ladder was. And so now I'm going in on top of the root ball, which, interesting fact about trees is that their roots are as big as their crown, and I think that's really cool. And I mixed green and orange together. Again, cheap Liquitex acrylic is what I'm using to do that, to make a different version of mud. So see how it's a different mud? And that's something that creates that, like, oh look, there's earth, because there's not ever grass all the way up to trees, because trees cover such a large amount of space that grass can't grow underneath them. And so you'll notice if you go and look at trees that grass grows about to where their roots are. So it's kind of interesting to see how they do that. And I do paint octopus trees. My trees are these, like, octopus or chubby dryad creatures. And dryads are just a woman in a tree. So now here I'm just throwing on the first layer of grass. And I've got a little bit of the orange on my paintbrush, and I'm grabbing at it and using it as I go. But feel free to mix more carefully, you know. Again, I said I mix while I'm on the canvas and while I'm creating. And so just use the flat brush to line around the edges, and it allows time for things to dry in between, and that's super helpful. So remember to keep your work in front of you. You can really strain your body, especially when you're creating a mural, if I was hunched over right there that whole time versus crouching down and painting. And so I noticed today my back hurt while I was doing this because I was hunched over, and then I readjusted and crawled underneath it. So yeah. remember to take a step back and look. And if I'd taken a better step back, I would have changed the shape of the top of the tree. But, you know, when you're looking at things in a video, it's a learning process. So remember to keep taking those steps back. And here I'm painting what looks like a red brick road to me right now, but it's just, I still had bright orange on the palette, and I don't tend to waste paint, and I knew I wanted this path to be like a stronger color. So I was trying to think of like how kids would crawl up a treehouse, you know, like they'd just hop over the roots, and so that's why I put the path the way it is. So yeah, it's fun to watch myself paint, actually. And now here I'm throwing in some more color in the roots, just being like, okay, what am I going to throw on there? And then now I'm going to take a second and mix up the colors that I wanted for my tree. And so what I used was orange and a little tiny bit of green. So I used probably 3 parts that bright orange that you see, and then 1 part that bright green that you see. And I mixed it together. And see, look here, I'm showing you. I'm mixing it. See, I'm using a palette knife. You're welcome to use a palette knife or a brush. I mix it partially, and then I come on top of it, and I switch brushes here. Here's when I move from that giant brush to a smaller, like flat-tipped brush. I really like flat brushes for underpaintings, but because this is so big, that's why I use such a big giant one. And here I'm coming in on top of it and painting it brown, but kind of a goldenrod brown, if you'll notice. So, when thinking of colors, do you think of background pieces as ones to make a little bit darker? I come in on that part right there, and I make this one a little bit darker with a little bit more green in it, because I know that those branches are behind. And so you can think of that when you're working with it. And that will help you map for your second layer. Now, each painting takes a different amount of layers. So when I'm talking about first layer and second layer, what I'm talking about, first layer is the mapping. It's that space where we're marking what we want and what is going to go there and what could potentially go there. Second layer is often where I start to define the actual light and the shadows, and the piece starts to look more like what I had in mind. And third layer is when I do all the finishing touches. Now, each of those layers can have 3 or 4 layers within them. For our project, though, I'm going to try to keep it to actually 3 layers. But we're already, by the time this piece finishes, we're already like 5 hours into this. And for me, I'm a really quick painter, so do give yourself more time to do this. You know, like, oftentimes people will spend a couple hours just drawing their tree, and that's okay. Just give yourself the time that you actually need to create the piece. And because I'm using a smaller brush, now I start to work with the lines that are on there. And I'm actually, as I'm working on this, you can't see the detail because, again, this is recorded on my phone. And so while it has good recording quality, it's not absolutely stellar. And so I'm actually starting to work with the bark and the texture on the bark. How wet it is doesn't show you that I'm working with the bark as well. So even if it was good quality, you wouldn't be able to see unless we were close up. Which, as we go into the second and third layers, I will be using more close-ups so you can see the process. Because right now it's just blocking in color. And you can block in color. It's like paint by number, but just coloring. So, yeah, just feel the flow and let the piece like speak to you by itself. Don't worry too much about how it's going to look, because you're going to make it look great. It's going to turn out totally fine. Again, this is the part which I said earlier in the intro, where oftentimes artists will get, especially beginning artists, will be like, oh man, my stuff looks terrible. Like, why did I even do this? And you don't need to be like that. This is a non-critical zone. You're painting this piece and it's going to be fun. And especially if you're painting this piece for kiddos, they aren't going to care at all. They're just going to think it's the coolest thing that you've ever done. Okay, so now I'm going back in and doing a couple of touch-ups on the background of the branches. And then I mix the tree color, and I dump some white on top of it, and I mix it in, and I begin throwing on the lighter wood color. This lighter wood color is one of my favorite colors. So I throw it on top of the pod, because I'm going to be creating an organic slat-shaped treehouse for that part. So I'm stroking from bottom to top and top to bottom to create those slats. And then the little treehouse there. If you don't know what color you want to do your treehouse, just go ahead and use whatever is on your palette that feels like it might be helpful in the background. If I know I want to do a light, bright treehouse, I use lighter colors as my background. Because when you're working on top of butcher paper, you need paint on it so that it can hold the further layers of paint. That first layer, it doesn't hold things. You'll find if you're working on a big canvas as well, that first layer doesn't cover all the white. That's another reason why we do so many layers when we're working. And I got a little bit in the way of this piece because I kind of got into painting, and that happens. But you know, I tried to get out of the way for you guys. So here I'm painting the signs, and I'm going to put cute little words on them like keep out, no adults allowed, secret hideaway. I think that's what I'm going to use on there. And so here I'm painting the little wooden ladder crawling up the tree. And then I'm adding to the inside part of the roof. Again, just color blocking. Color blocking, super simple. You just follow your lines. It's not hard at all. As long as you just trust yourself, because that's part of it, you know, like sometimes we just get in our own way. Here, this is a little wooden door, and the little Dr. Seuss house is going to have a little bit of that color. All right. That about comes to the end of our piece. So thank you so much for watching, and next week we'll do layer 2. And if you liked it, feel free to give us a thumbs up and subscribe. And I look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you so much for watching. It's really fun to teach you a little bit of the things that I know how to do.